Hello everyone, Professor Kruzluk here. So I wanted to make a video with us looking at some examples of federalism in action. So in my previous video, we did an overview of what federalism is, its role in U.S. democracy, its role in the U.S. government. So we've already talked about what federalism is. It's this division of power between the national and state governments and different state governments. But what I wanted us to go further into and beyond the theory is how federalism actually shapes real world politics today. In class, we oftentimes spend less time with the evolution of a theory and how the theory impacts our lives today, trying to connect it with our lives. And that's kind of what this video will do, because these examples will help us connect these abstract ideas, connect concepts from the textbook, abstract concepts from just American politics with the political and policy debates we hear in the news every day. So like every American government textbook out there uses the example of marijuana legalization. It is I kid you not, like every textbook that I've used uses medical marijuana, uses some sort of marijuana legalization to emphasize federalism. So let's start with marijuana policy. Under federal law, marijuana remains illegal. It's classified as a Schedule I drug, the same category as heroin. In that category, research, studies, and the sale is illegal. But in states like Colorado, Washington, California, they have legalized marijuana for recreational use, while dozens more allow it for medical use. This creates a patchwork system. What's legal in Denver might get you arrested in a different city. And then federal agencies technically could enforce the national ban, but in practice they often look the other way. So this is a classic example of federalism in action. State governments experimenting with policies, even when those policies conflict with federal law. It shows the flexibility of federalism, but also the confusion, because what is legal or illegal depends on where you are. So another example we could use is abortion policy after the Dobbs versus Jackson decision. So this is another dramatic example that textbooks are starting to use if they are being updated. So in 2022, the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, which had guaranteed a federal constitutional right to abortion for nearly 50 years. After Dobbs versus Jackson, authorities shifted back to the states. Since then, some states like Texas, Mississippi, and Oklahoma have enacted near total bans, while others, California, New York, Illinois, have expanded access and added new protections, sometimes into constitutions. And this has some states have gone through the legislature, some states have gone through more direct democracy, asking voters what they want. So what this has turned out to be is a patchwork of rights, where access to abortion is determined not by federal law, but instead by the state you live in. This raises the question of what's the future of abortion? Does it stay at the state level? What happens when one access to reproductive rights vary depending on where you live? So medical marijuana, legalized marijuana, maybe not in the news quite as much as it used to be. But abortion policy and this idea of federalism as it relates to abortion is front and center in every election now. Candidates talking about what their policy is. Should it be a state issue? Should it be a federal government issue? Reproductive rights absolutely have come to the forefront of American politics. So we also sometimes see healthcare being debated. Healthcare often is something that candidates, again, are running on. I will expand Medicaid, or I will expand Medicare, or I will find a way to have more affordable healthcare. So healthcare, a huge issue in the U.S. that is playing out politically. So healthcare also offers another key example of federalism. When the Affordable Care Act passed in 2010, it had included a provision expanding Medicaid to cover more low-income Americans. The federal government offered to pay most of those costs. But in 2012, the Supreme Court ruled that the Medicaid expansion was optional. That means states got to decide whether they joined or not. Today, most states have expanded Medicaid, but some, especially in the South, like Texas, Florida, have not. They've refused to expand. This means that many Americans in non-expansion states remain uninsured, while people in expansion states have increased access to health coverage. So again, this is federalism in action. The same federal law, but with very different outcomes depending on what state you live in. Again, also differences between the states. So we brought up this idea of environmental policy, environmental regulation, also demonstrates federalism. California is famous for setting stricter air quality and emissions standards than the federal government. Under the Clean Air Act, states can apply for a waiver to exceed federal rules, and California oftentimes leads the way. Automakers sometimes prefer a single national standard, while California pushes for tougher rules. In effect, one state, because of its size, shapes national policy. Other states can choose to follow California's standards or not. This creates another example of states as innovators, laboratories of democracies, but also highlights the complexity of overlapping authority. So another example of federalism at work, and perhaps the most vivid in recent years, is how states handled the COVID-19 pandemic. The federal government provided guidelines through the CDC, vaccine mandates for federal employees, and emergency funding. But states determined their own roles for mask mandates, business closures, and school reopenings. California, New York, and Massachusetts opted for stricter measures, while Florida, Texas, and South Dakota resisted lockdowns and mandates, and when they did occur, they were much shorter and less forceful. So the result was 50 different approaches to the same national issue. Some argued that this flexibility allowed states to tailor policies to their circumstances, which we see as a highlight of federalism. What works in Iowa might not work in New Jersey. What environmental and agricultural policies that make sense in South Dakota might not make any sense to someone in New Jersey. And so one piece of federalism is this flexibility. So when people argued that this flexibility with COVID-19, it allowed states to tailor policies to their circumstances. However, others argued it caused confusion and undermined a unified response from authorities. But this is federalism, and it's most visible, and at times it's most controversial. So what else is controversial is immigration policy. Shows federalism at the local level. Immigration enforcement is primarily a federal responsibility, but some cities like San Francisco, Chicago, New York have declared themselves as sanctuary cities, limiting cooperation with federal immigration authorities. This leads to conflicts over funding, conflicts over enforcement. The federal government wants uniform policies, while local governments insist they know best how to handle their communities and their localized policy situations. It's another example of how overlapping powers create tensions, but also provide multiple areas for political action and citizen involvement in a democracy. So, what do we see across these examples? Federalism creates flexibility, space for innovation, this idea of laboratories of democracy. But it also produces inequality, inconsistencies, and sometimes chaos. Whether it's marijuana laws, abortion access, healthcare, environmental laws, pandemic responses, or immigration policy. The key theme is this: in the United States, politics doesn't stop in Washington at the national level. It's constantly being negotiated between federal and state governments. So now we have a good understanding of what federalism is, and we have some examples of federalism at work, not only between the federal and state governments, but also between different states and localities, trying to find policies that make sense for their constituencies. And at times, other areas then embrace those policies, and even at other times, those policies can make their way to the national level, and that is how federalism was designed.